Brains in Motion with Mary McKone, EdD and Angela Zielinski, DPT. Please remember that this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. This is not medical advice, and this is just general discussion for educational purposes. Thank you. Enjoy. Welcome to Brains in Motion. We are starting with episode 3. Mary, what are we talking about?
In episode 3, we're going to talk about reflexes, their relationship to gross and fine motor skills, and how that impacts how we learn about the world. Well, in the first episode, we talked about how most people think of reflexes just as motor movement, but that these movement patterns, which are genetically encoded, map out the entire brain. In this segment, we're actually going to look at the development of those gross and fine motor skills and why these are so important for cognition, executive function, self-regulation, and how we experience and show up in the world.
Yeah, and gross and fine motor skills are a lot of what I think of for physical therapy. So I'm excited about this topic. And like you said, they are so important. And I'm excited to tell people more about it. So Mary, what are gross motor skills?
Well, gross motor skills use the large muscles of the arms, legs, and torso for things like rolling and sitting and crawling and standing and walking. These movements help infants coordinate and control their whole body, and they form the base for more precise fine motor movements like grasping and manipulating objects. So think big muscles. Gross literally means large. So think big muscles.
Big muscles. And big muscle movements are easiest to see. We, like you said, like the sitting, the crawling, it's easy to see quality of gross motor skills because it's involving all of our large muscle movements, whereas fine motor skills, you're looking more at fingers and you're looking more at eye movements. We'll cover that next, but fine motor skills are harder. The quality of those are harder to see sometimes because they're smaller, which is what the fine motor skills are.
Right. Oftentimes when I'm meeting with a family for the first time, and I'll say, well, what are some of your concerns? And they're like, well, they look really awkward when they run, or they can't climb, or they didn't crawl as a baby. And like you said, those are the things that are easy to see. And so those are oftentimes some of the first things that people mention when they notice that something's kind of gone awry. Mm-hmm.
I like that example. My other favorite example is like butt scooting. That's like a common way that people notice their child might not crawl, but they can get around, and they're really good at getting around, but they're using a different pattern or different technique, like butt scooting. And so we have these gross motor skills. We are learning them from development. Why are the gross motor skills so important?
Well, motor skills let infants roll and reach and crawl, like we were just talking about, and walk, and this helps them explore their environment. This active exploration is the primary way that infants learn about objects and space and cause and effect. And when they don't have good motor skills, they're missing some of that understanding of themselves and the environment and how their bodies interact and fit in the environment. They're also linked to brain development in areas involved in attention and problem solving and other cognitive skills, especially in the first years of life.
They are, because babies learn through movement. We've talked about that before, about how babies learn cause and effect. I touch this and then this happens, or I cry and my mom comes and picks me up. That's not a gross motor skill, but it's that cause and effect piece of if I roll towards the right, maybe I get my bottle. Or if I shimmy a little bit to the left, I can get this fun crinkly piece of cloth that I've been eyeing for 2 minutes, right? Because it's the 2 minutes that nobody's watching that babies always end up in a different position. And those are gross motor skills. And that's how babies problem solve. And they often problem solve when we aren't looking or we aren't helping.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh, I call one of my granddaughters ninja hands because the second you're not looking, that kid can grab anything that she's not supposed to have.
Yes, yes, and once they get older and they're toddlers and they're walking, every parent knows how fast a toddler can move or end up on a counter or behind some object that you swore that you put away or that they
Mhm.
couldn't get behind, that it definitely is not big enough for a child to squeeze through, and you're like, "Oh, it is."
Right?
They are so good at just getting into places they shouldn't, but that's great for learning, brain development,
Right.
as
Yes.
well as physical development, because you gain strength through trying different things and using different body parts. Um, and then the last piece, they also gross motor skills help with our social and emotional development too, right, Mary?
Absolutely, because these successful movement experiences build confidence and self-esteem. Like the first time a toddler uh, figures out they can turn their body and kind of scoot down your lap onto the floor.
Mm.
And they're like, well, look at me. Look at what I just did. I got down off of grandma's lap all by myself. Aha! Or they're able to crawl over to something that they wanted and they have that reward of accomplishing their task. It builds self confidence in their abilities and in their bodies. And persistent motor difficulties can really impact um, children and that they may avoid play because it's uncomfortable or they intuitively know they don't have the skill set to do that and they may feel frustrated or left out because they can't accomplish the thing that they want, like um a baby who's trying to crawl to something but they can't quite get into bower crawling. They can't get their legs down, and so they lay there so frustrated because their little legs are just going in the air because they can't get them down to push forward. And there, this leads to frustration and feelings of I can't do this thing that I want to do. And as kids get older, they may avoid doing those things, which we see a lot with, 7, 8, 9-year-old boys who completely avoid sports altogether because they don't have the motor skills of vestibular proprioceptive awareness to be able to accomplish those tasks. What do you have to say on that topic?
Well, yeah, I was just thinking of when you said the frustration piece, the one I commonly see is when the infants are stuck in what I call their swimming phase. So they lift up their arms, and we call it landau, and they get stuck where they want to go forward, but instead of going forward, their body arches, their arms go up, sometimes their legs come up too, and then they flop back down. Like they want to go
Mhm.
forward, but their body goes into this swim position, and it's hard.
Super
Or Superman. Oh,
Superman,
sorry,
right?
yes, Superman, and what happens is you need that reflex to turn on around 6 months. That's developmentally appropriate and what is supposed to happen, but what can happen is that they get stuck in that reflex. Instead of that reflex integrating, turning on, and then integrating like we talked about last session, you have to turn on in order to integrate. It turns on and then it just dominates instead of integrating, and so you get stuck, you get frustrated, then a hyperextension pattern can happen, and that can sometimes lead to different movement patterns or just different ways where like you said, instead of trying to do this, I'm gonna just give up. And so it's an interesting
Mhm,
pattern and
mhm.
definitely can lead to different emotional pieces as infants as well as later.
I just wanted to add a little piece about brain development in here, because I always like to pull it back to the structures of the brain. And the cerebellum is where, as you know, are where movements are initiated from early in life when they're mostly reflexive. The cerebellum develops from the middle out, and that's how we develop awareness of our body from the center or proximal out, which we call distal in our work. So center out. And gross motor skills are really midline cerebellum. the middle part for our core, intermediate cerebellum for our limbs, and then fine motor is the lateral or outer bands of the cerebellum on both sides. So when we look at gross and fine motor, it also has to do with the development of the cerebellum, which is involved in a lot of things, speech and auditory processing and proprioception and vestibular. Those are all involved greatly in the cerebellum. So we're looking at gross motor, but we're also looking at about what does that tell us about what's going on in the brain and why kids might also be having speech issues or why they might also be having proprioceptive issues. It's the same part of the brain, right? So the body can give us a great deal of information about what's going on neurologically.
Very cool. I like when you bring it all back together, but that also made me think of a lot of times when I'm doing reflex integration, when I first started, speech would improve for younger kids, and it was this really cool thing that I didn't understand when I first started was when I'm working on hands, I'm working on feet, and I'm working on all these reflex integrations, and they had a speech delay, or maybe they weren't talking yet. Maybe they were 2 and hadn't said more than 1 or 2 words, and then we would do reflex integration and specifically a lot of hand work one day, and the next day, they say 5 new words, and it was so crazy and so exciting, and it's so cool to be like, "Oh, it's because hands and speech and all of these pieces are all linked together in the same parts
Yeah.
of the brain, and it's amazing."
Yeah. And literally, the hands are lateral cerebellum, and the speech portions of the brain, it's called the linguistic cerebellum, are also in the outer bands. Just like similarly, like the Babinski reflex is so connected with speech because the big toe is connected to the tongue through the system of fascia in the body, but also feet, outer part of the cerebellum. So you can do one thing and see benefits from another part. Um, but anyways, we're digressing, I think, but it's okay.
Oh, no, I was gonna
Okay,
link
here we
it.
go.
Here we
Ready?
go, here's the
And
link. So hands are what a lot of people think as fine motor. You should have seen Mary's face. If we had video, she was like,
that's
"Oh, that
good.
was good." But I didn't realize until Mary put this all in that, eyes were considered fine motor skills, so that was a neat so, Mary, tell me what are fine motor skills? Because as a PT, I think of them as just my fingers and my coordination with my fingers and my hands
Okay.
and toes.
Yep.
How about tell me what
So
it really
these are
is?
the small muscle groups. So the furthest away from the center of the body. So hands and feet, obviously, so fingers and toes, but also all of the tiny little muscles that control your eye movements, fine motor, right? And also your tongue and the muscles around your mouth, also fine motor. Yep.
So
So think
interesting.
about it. Center of the body is at the navel. Kind of go from the furthest point out, and what do you get? Those are your fine motors. Yeah.
Yeah, and like and you said they butt up against in the brain. You said the
Yeah.
language centers or the
Cerebellum.
linguistics, and so if we have that, that makes sense why working on things like
Mm-hmm.
hands and feet improve
Well,
speech.
and there's this other connection. This is really a side topic,
Ooh,
but I
tell me.
learned this years ago, and I was so fascinated, and I used it in my classroom, and it worked. And so the sensory motor cortex that runs, across the top of your head there,
Mm,
kind of between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Um, Once we get past reflexive movement, it's there that movement is initiated from basal ganglia and the sensory motor cortex. And for the listeners, you can't see a drawing, so I'm just going to try and visualize it for you. There's a place on that sensory motor cortex for every part of our body. The hands take up a tremendous amount of space on that sensory motor cortex. It's called homunculus man. Isn't that what they call that? Yeah. So like they draw in these drawings, they like draw parts of a person across this motor cortex, and the hand is like a third of it. Well,
mhm.
on the left side of the brain, the sensory motor cortex part of the hand is like right above the Broca center of the brain, which is one of the speech centers. So I was in a training like 25 years ago in brain gym, and somebody said, "Oh, well, writing with your right hand actually activates the language centers of your brain." And I was like, "How's that?" Yeah, I'm skeptical. And they're like, "Oh, well, because it's right above it's right above the Broca center, and when you move your hand, our brain works off of electrical impulses. So the sensory motor cortex fires, and the electrical impulses actually fire off the Broca center because it's so close." And I was like, "No way." So I went back to my classroom. I was teaching high school reading, and I thought, okay, I'm going to try this out. So I gave the kids a squishy ball to hold in their right hand, a really soft squishy ball. And while we were doing our fluency builders, like, reading the target words that I had taught them, fat, mat, hat, sat, and we timed them for 1 minute, I had them squeeze the squishy ball. And I'm not kidding you, the kids would gain 20 to 30 words per minute just by moving their right hand while they read.
That's amazing.
Isn't it wild? So I'm going to segue back to fine motor skills. So we think about them as being completely separate, but nothing in the brain and body is completely separate. So when we do have deficits in fine motor, it might show up in our hands. We have poor handwriting, but then that also means that other parts of our brain are not getting the input that they need, because of those delayed skills. So that's just my fun little story from my days in the classroom.
That's a great story. That's so incredible. I really liked how you said, and it's a good reminder that nothing works separately. Even when we want to categorize it, even when we put them into gross motor and fine motor pieces, it's all working together. And so, why are fine motor skills important? The same reasons why gross motor skills are important. They help us interact with our environments, they help us be successful. It's the same, it's even more for me. I have found, like kids that I've worked with, the social and emotional development. Fine motor can actually lead to a lot more frustration, I feel like, because handwriting, school, um, being able to do smaller movements can be so challenging and requires what I have found, like, more focus to do a fine motor
Mhm.
skill than a gross motor skill, and that just might be my own personal feelings. Because my phone ask me to do a button, and I will be like, can it be big? Can it be a large button?" And, like, all of my shoes are, shoes that I don't
Slip-ins.
yep, that I don't have to tie or that are loosely tied once, so I don't have to keep going back to it. But even like that frustration of being something, like wanting to do something and it not being easy,
Mhm.
I can get a lot of frustration from fine motor skills. I mean, both,
Sure.
but yes, I've seen a lot of that development and that piece with fine motor skills more so than gross motor skills for some kids.
Sure. And fine motor skills won't emerge until gross motor skills are solidly in place. So
Yes.
if there are fine motor deficits, there's always gross motor deficits. Always. I've never
Ooh. No, I just think that's an interesting statement because we again, we think of them as separately. Like, a lot of
right,
people yeah, no, like, that's an interesting piece.
right? So if you think again about that cerebellum, right? So maybe a kid has discovered their core, but how many kids do we work with that actually have good postural control?
Yeah.
But if they have good postural control, but maybe when they run, they bring their arms up. I think some people like call them chicken wings or whatever, right? So you're like, okay, well, something's going on with the limbs. So we're an intermediate cerebellum, and then there's going to be fine motor with the hands because the brain hasn't quite mapped that out all the way. So it's still working with what it has. So it brings the arms in closer to the core because that's what it knows. Like, okay, I can control that and I'll bring my arms up here, but then you'll see issues with the hands. And something you said triggered this for me, but the hands and feet are also about safety and security.
Tell me more.
Well, in an infant, if mom Or dad puts their finger on baby's hand, what will they do immediately? Grasp right onto it. Hands grasp is about security with mom, and when they nurse or bottle feed, they'll hold on to a finger. But if somebody's really having a hard time and they're stressed out and they feel like they might not make it through something, what do we say to them? Just hang on, you're almost there,
Yeah.
right? Or we might say to somebody, get a grip. Like instinctively, we know that the hands have something to do with safety and holding on emotionally. So there's a big emotional component. And with feet too, it's about stability. So, like, say that you were on a boat and it started to rock quite a bit, you would find yourself grasping your toes to hold on because our hands and feet reflexes are mirrors of each other, right? Plantar and palmar. So they are about security. So if you have unintegrated hands and foot reflexes, oftentimes you will also see some anxiety because the brain does not feel secure because those are the earliest sensory reflexes, and they do have a lot to do with feeling secure in the world and being able to hold on.
I like that. It's also it made me think of I took some lactation counseling classes just because I work with
Hmm.
infants and wanted to learn more about that piece of it. And one of the signals for when you're done with feeding is supposed to be they open their hands more, that they've relaxed, they're full, they're satiated, they feel, like you said, safe and
Right.
they're done. So I think that's so interesting and a great point. Um,
Hmm.
and we're talking about all that, like you said, the reflexes how we've talked a lot about gross motor, we've talked about fine motor. So, how do reflexes play a role in both of these? Well, my answer is they're everything. Reflexes are everything. And Mary's good about breaking things down. So, will you tell me, Mary, like your view of how primitive reflexes and reflex integration is related to gross and fine motor movements?
That many primitive reflexes. So remember, primitive are reflexes that are present at birth. Directly prepare or shape the early gross motor actions, like 18R and TLR are involved in early rolling. STNR helps the infant move into quadruped or on all fours to start crawling and then up to walking because STNR is like the transitional reflex. Um, and then, like through repetition, through tummy time and rolling and pushing up and early crawling, the brain learns from these kind of reflex driven movements and gradually refines them into more coordinated, purposeful motions like sitting independently, crawling with reciprocal arm and leg. That means opposites, right? Opposite arms and legs. Um, and then as the cortex, so the higher part of the brain develops, those primitive reflexes get integrated, hopefully, and then, and typically, between 6 and 12 months, there's a couple that hang on till about 3. So then that movement is no longer dominated by automatic patterns, i.e., reflexes, but by voluntary control. So we've moved the pattern out of sensory response, reflexive action into I want that toy and I'm going to crawl over and grab that toy and then hand it to mom, right? As opposed to I want to roll over and I turned my head and I flipped into 18R, right? That's the reflexive movement. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. And then, we've talked a lot about what happens with if primitive reflexes stay present. You want to kind of give our listeners a review of that?
Yeah, if the primitive reflexes stay present, you are dominated by the response. You are stuck is what I would like that's the version I think of. And for what I'm thinking of is like when you said rolling. So you have to have repetition for rolling to integrate reflexes like ATNR, galant. You need to be able to roll to both sides, so
Uh-huh.
symmetrical to be able to do it. And that repetition piece makes me think of when babies go through their sleep regressions. Often they're practicing rolling at night, right? They think it's fun, and so you're moving from that primitive to that like exploration repetition phase. And then you can have a baby that you place down, they see a toy, and they can choose to roll to that toy.
Mhm.
And if you have a primitive reflex that isn't working correctly or isn't coordinated, maybe you will only roll to the right. Every time you roll, you're only going to roll right and you never roll to the left. And that's one of the sneaky ones because as a new parent, you're tired, you're exhausted, you're just excited they rolled. You might not be paying attention to if they're rolling equally to both sides unless you're a PT or an OT or you've had other kids or you've gone through it. If you might just be like, "Yes, I'm this is amazing." The other part of rolling is, are they leading with their head? Are they leading with their arm? Are they hyperextending to roll? Like, there's babies who will push with their head to roll instead of
Mhm.
using their bodies to roll, so that way you think, "Oh, they're rolling," but the pattern matters, the quality matters. Otherwise, reflexes won't integrate, and they'll hang on, and your body will think that it needs to move a specific way to get something
Mhm.
instead of being able to choose and freely move.
And we would call those compensations, right? Like
Yes.
when your brain figures out another way to make it happen, you know. I mean, not a reflex thing, but I'm a pretty short person. I'm 5'2". So most of my life, there's been a lot of things that I had to figure out how to make happen because I just wasn't tall enough, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
you're like, okay, how could I possibly reach that thing? And I think of that a lot with kids when they have retained reflexes. Their body's just trying to figure out, like kids who skip crawling and walk, they figure it out, but they're compensating. There's compensation patterns in their body when they do that because
Yes.
they didn't have all the mechanisms built in, which, you know, postural reflexes build on the primitive ones. And as the primitive reflexes integrate and the postural reflexes kind of take over, um, then that provides those automatic adjustments that allows us to respond to gravity and keep our bodies in alignment. So, like when kids are, they bump into things a lot or they fall down a lot, there's a disconnect between proprioception and vestibular, but then there's also compensation patterns that have happened in their body that aren't allowing them to move through space freely. And then that goes back to the play and interaction. They're clumsy. They don't have good hand-eye coordination. They can't run fast. They get fatigued easily, and then they get excluded from these play activities and these social activities. And that can be so detrimental for a kid when they're excluded, you know?
Yeah, that's hard because play is so important, right? Like, play helps us learn about the world. It's fun. It helps us interact. And when I like you're right, the compensations, like bodies are smart. Bodies are going to figure out how to do something. It may not be the easiest way, but it works for a body.
Mhm.
And the more you stress the system, like more complicated movements, more factors, like, oh, someone's yelling at me and I have to catch a ball. Your system, the compensations don't hold. And that's when you can
Mhm.
see that, oh, I need a better pathway. I need
Mhm.
an easier transition to be able to participate in all these things. And that's where the reflex integration can come in because it can help with that foundation piece. Instead of working so hard, you can use and open up different pathways to be able to participate easier, in my mind.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Said made me think of something of like the postural reflexes and compensations. STNR is one of the reflexes that helps move in from belly crawling to crawling on hands and knees to moving into like tall kneeling and standing and walking. And it's a very common reflex that isn't integrated in a lot of kids
Mhm.
that I see, and it was not integrated in myself for a long time, may still have trouble with it if I'm being honest, but I say that because it shows up a lot in adults, and I talk about it about adults and linking it to kids because adults can verbalize what's happening and kids can't, right?
Mhm.
It shows up a lot secretly with adults for adults who like stand-up desks because I could have my legs straight and my arms bent while I'm working. And
Yes.
it's really hard if STNR is not integrated to sit at a desk with my legs bent, my arms bent, and be comfortable and be able to focus. But if you do some STNR work, then it's a little bit easier. But if you don't know about reflex integration, we just compensate. And the compensation would be stand up desk. Why is it so much easier? People think it's easier because I'm not sitting. Maybe it's because that reflex isn't integrated and
Hmm.
your body's fighting itself while it's sitting. And now you can focus because you're not fighting your body.
I have a great story about STNR. I
Yeah.
was years and years and years ago. I subbed one summer at a charter school, and I'd never worked at this school before. And on the first day, I'm in this class, and this poor child. This was a first grade class. We're sitting on the rug, and he can't sit on his bum. He's got his legs under him, and about every minute, he would throw himself down on his belly, and he'd have to lay flat on his belly. And then, the other kids would be like, Joe, get up, Joe, get up. And he'd look at me and goes, I'm so sorry. And then he'd try and sit right again, crisscross applesauce, and he couldn't. So he'd put his legs on him, and then he'd throw himself down on his belly. And I just looked at this child and I just thought, oh my God, the reflex is strong with this one,
Yeah.
Like oh, poor guy. And then when it was time to sit at the desk, about every 2 minutes, he would have to get up and run around the room. And then
Oh,
he'd look at me, he goes, I'm so sorry. And then he would sit back down, and then he would get up and run around the room. And I mean, it was so chaotic.
oh,
And I
buddy.
just I was just like, oh, there was another kid in the class that was crawling around the floor, meowing like a cat the whole time. So that was definitely an interesting experience. Um, But that poor kiddo that he knew instinctively what he should be doing, he
Yes.
just could not make his body do it. I've never seen an STNR that active before. When I saw him throw himself down on his stomach, I was like, "Oh, your body still thinks your body like, your brain thinks your body is one long piece."
Yes.
It hasn't even segmented yet. It doesn't even know it has a top and a bottom yet.
And it's so interesting because we, as like reflex integration practitioners, know that he's trying to put his body where he needs to, but that can show up as um not listening. It can show up as being disruptive. It shows up as a kiddo who
Hyperactivity.
thank you. And we
Mhm,
know that it's him trying to regulate his body and give his body what he needs, and it just shows up in different ways. And
mhm.
um yeah, and it makes me think of so, like, STNR going into fine motor, how gross motor affects fine motor. If you can't sit comfortably, handwriting, how does a kid write in school if I'm so uncomfortable sitting?
Right. Well, in STNR and writing, I don't think most people who aren't reflex people understand how important STNR is for writing and ATNR. But in STNR, when you're crawling on all fours and quadruped, this is where your brain realizes, oh, my hands are separate from my arm because you're putting your full body weight on your hands while you're crawling around, and you're separating your arms from your trunk really for the first time with weight bearing. So it's like all of a sudden the brain's like, oh wait, this moves separately from my trunk. My arm, sorry, you can't see me. I'll spell it out. My arm can move separately from my trunk, and my hand can move separately from my arm. And we have to have that for writing because, speaking of compensations, what happens when kids can't move their hand independently? They end up doing like a power grip on the pen, and
Mm.
it's the arm that's doing the writing, right? So if you watch a kid and they've got their whole hand wrapped around the pen, when they write, their whole arm is moving.
Oh,
And
yeah, now that you mention it,
yes,
yeah,
right?
right.
So their brain's like, oh no, this arm is not separate from your torso. So you're just going to have to use your whole arm to write. So then you get these giant letters and they're not well formed. And because when you write in tripod correctly, it's actually the fingers are the only part that should be moving.
Mm.
But think about all the levels of differentiation that have to happen to get to this little writing movement. I wish our viewers could see me right now because I'm
And
doing all
she's
kinds of
writing with a
movements.
very nice tripod grip with just her fingers moving, and she's moving, and as she's doing it, it's making me think, so in the basal ganglia protocol, there's a little tripod maneuver that you use
Yes.
to help with this in this basal ganglia protocol that, MNRI uses, so it's interesting.
Hmm.
I didn't realize, because probably Angela doesn't write the correct way, that that those are linked.
Well,
I knew
also, I
hands
was a teacher
grasp.
too.
That's true, and you were big, and I know hands grasp is important for integrating for handwriting, but I didn't realize that specific,
Hmm.
pattern.
So you can tell a lot what's going on with the kids' reflexes by having them pick up a pen and write. And
Yeah.
and so, like, when I was teaching, high school reading, I'd the first few days, I would just watch the kids and what they did with their bodies, and you're like, 18R,
Mhm.
STNR, so, I had kids that had to turn the the chair around backwards so that they could lean on the front of it and, like, kinda put their legs behind them and kinda
Mhm.
bounce. We had kind of flexible chairs, so they would kind of bounce themselves on it, so they didn't have to segment their back from their waist the same, or they'd have to stand, or a kid laid on the floor under his desk. I'm like, whatever, as long as you're learning, we're good. I don't care. Um, but watching them write and how they held their pen, and do they turn their body one side? Because that's usually 18R, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
how do they accomplish that? So we talked a lot about STNR. So do you want to talk about another reflex and how it's related to gross and fine motor?
I feel like we covered a lot. You talked about, I feel you touched a little bit on ATNR and spinal galant. That's like your it shows up. I feel like we talk about it a lot, and we're gonna continue to talk about it a lot because they're integral in multiple things that we do, but they're one of the big reflexes that helps with rolling. It also is their postural reflexes. They are involved in handwriting because I think of me as where they're kids that lean to one side on a bent elbow and they're looking towards a
Mm-hmm.
straight arm when they write. Um, it also ATNR shows up a lot in, I feel like, walking and running, or with kids who play sports where maybe one foot is slightly turned out and then the other, or maybe one side of your body can do something, but the other side of your body can't. And sometimes that is just you've learned it, you've practiced it one way, but sometimes you practice it that one way because the other side isn't
Mm-hmm.
accessible. And so is it the chicken or the egg? Is the
Right. Well, I used to joke around that I was so right-sided dominant, that my left side was just there for decoration. But what I really learned, it was because my 18R was so active.
Mhm.
The only side I had available in my body was the right side. My how I succeeded so well at school, I mean, I was top of my class. I don't know how that happened,
Bodies are
because
cool.
it shouldn't have happened with with the amount of reflexes that I had active. But uh yeah, so I literally had, like, no ability to do anything with the left side of my body at all, and it was all right-sided. It's evened out quite a bit now, but, I was 40 until I got rid of that pattern, so 40 years of that, it's still not, anywhere equal, but it's a lot better. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm a right-sided 18R as well. Um, you also put TLR, which this reflex, I feel like it's a really big reflex.
That's tonic labyrinthine reflex for
Ooh,
our listeners.
thank you. And I think of it as a big vestibular reflex and a big posture reflex. And I
Mhm.
also think of it as the one, myself being an example, of kids who are most successful when they're sitting on an exercise ball and bouncing.
Mhm.
But that's, uh, seeking, like, that proprioception because I don't quite know where I am in space, and I feel like TLR is one that helps more than we realize with where
Mhm.
am I in space.
Yeah.
What do you think, Mary?
W Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a postural reflex, and there's 2 sides to it. There's extension and flexion. It is used in the birth process. It's kind of how babies do the wiggle worm through the birth canal. 18R is also involved in birthing, so is STNR, but um, TLR is a big one. And in extension, the head is up, the arms are up, and then the feet extend, so they'll point. So toe walkers often have
Mm.
a very active TLR. And then in flexion, the head is down, the arms come down and kind of go behind the body a little bit, like they're going to dive into a pool, and then the feet flex. So, really involved with developing the back muscles for postural control and that vestibular spinal tract that runs right up the two sides of the spine, which also spinal galant is so involved in. So, like TLR, 18R, spinal galant, Landau, those are also involved in the development of our postural control and our ability to rotate our torso, bend our torso, um, hold ourselves upright all day in school. One thing I noticed when I was a teacher, I hear this a lot from parents too, is that by the end of the day, kids were just like laying on the desk.
Mm.
You know,
Mhm.
my high schoolers would come fifth and sixth period, and people say, "Oh, it's just because they never eat," or, but I was like, "No, I think they're just exhausted."
Mm.
Like when you lack postural control, it is a lot of work to keep your body upright all day.
Yeah.
It is a lot of work and it is exhausting. And I know we talk about ourselves a lot on this podcast, but it's personal experience. So I have a lot of degeneration going on in my spine, particularly in the thoracic region, which is why I'm not practicing in person anymore, only remotely. But I've lost some postural control because of that. And there are days when it's inflamed and the nerve pain is going on that it's exhausting to keep my body upright. So I'll find myself laying down multiple times a day to take gravity out of the mix or wearing a back brace to help support myself, which helps a lot. But thinking about how that relates to kids with postural control issues, that is gross motor. Our torso muscles are gross motor. So to bring it back to our actual topic, when kids lack that postural control because they have these reflexes retained and those gross motor muscles have not fully developed, sitting in school all day is an exhausting experience. And that doesn't even account for having to keep themselves still and listen and handle all the sensory information and not hit your friends and respond when somebody speaks to you, like all the demands of school. It starts with, can I keep myself in my chair all day?
It makes me think of this being one of the components of, like, the after-school collapse that a lot of parents and
Yes.
kids talk about of, like,
Yes.
you need gross motor and postural control, and by the time you get home, if you have been holding yourself up all day because it's an unsafe environment, and you were talking about hands and rigidity, right? So, first, you're trying to keep it together, and you get home in safety, and you're exhausted because
Hmm.
you've been holding it together, like you said. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting piece, not only the sensory components and not only the safety components, but the postural components as well.
Hmm.
And kids are working hard. We're all working hard, aren't we? Like,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah,
so
we
many
are.
pieces we're using our muscles, we're using our nervous system, we are interacting, we're playing, and we're using gross motor skills and fine motor skills all day long, really, because if you're typing, let's say you're on the computer, you're typing with your fingers. Gross motor, you're holding up your posture, hopefully in a nice posture while you're on the computer and not leaned over or hunched so
Mhm.
that you have neck pain and things like that. But kids use their gross motor and fine motor movements to interact with the world. That's how they learn. That's how they
Mhm.
they grow because the more you move, the stronger you become. The more
Mhm.
you move, the more you learn. The more you move, the more that you can problem solve. And we've talked about babies and how they learn. We've talked a little bit about toddlers. Um, One of the things that Mary had put down, because she's such a good a good linear thinker and makes our outlines while I just show up. Um, Mary
Not
has
true. Don't listen to her.
has that, toddlers and developing physical boundaries. Let's talk a little bit, I like this a lot, about how gross and fine motor movements help toddlers learn about boundaries.
So this also comes back to proprioception, which uh, I assume at another time we'll probably talk just about proprioception because it's such a big topic. But our proprioceptors are integrally involved in reflex integration and physical movement because most people just think of proprioception as where we are in space, which is true, but we have 7 types of proprioceptors. So every time a muscle moves, our Golgi tendon bodies and our joints and our muscle spindle cells and our muscles are communicating back and forth with the basal ganglia, and that's how we get extension and flexion of our muscles. Right, we contract and extend them is through proprioceptors. So just trying to make sure we stay kind of connected to our topic. So as we're moving our bodies, we have to have proprioception activated to be able to move, but we continue to develop good proprioception through movement. It is the movement of our bodies that then reinforce and strengthen our proprioceptors. And then we develop an awareness of where we are in space. But then as we bump into things or we're moving around, whether we're crawling or, as babies are cruising around and holding onto the couch, they're developing an awareness of the boundaries of their own body. How far do I have to reach my hand out to reach the couch? If I'm going to fall, how far away am I from mom? Is she there to catch me? Or when my granddaughter raises her arms for me to pick her up, she's developing an awareness of how far away she is from me so that I can reach her to pick her up. And that won't happen. That spatial awareness of understanding where we are in relationship to the rest of our world doesn't happen without development of those, particularly the gross motor skills.
Yeah, and it makes me and tying it to reflexes, one of the most common reflexes that I talk about to establish all the things that Mary was talking about is hand supporting. So hand supporting helps with cruising because I have to be able to place my hands on the couch and be able to feel where I am in space. So cruising, like walking along a couch, I've met babies who won't put their hands out, and so or they have to keep their elbows bent, or there's when you said catch yourself when you fall, hand supporting is supposed to turn on in front when you're sitting at 6 months, and then lateral comes next, and then backwards is the last one to come, but that helps with your physical boundaries of where I am in space, which can, if they are reinforced and they're online, can help with physical boundaries of your space, my space is what I think of with hand supporting. If I have solid hand supporting, I know that I have my space and I'm not going to let you come into my space. Or vice versa, if I know I have my space, if I have too much hand supporting, I might try and get into your space.
Right.
And so
So,
having that piece connected is important.
yep. And not every discipline and reflex world teaches hand supporting. So, for our listeners, I'll just kind of describe that. If you were walking along the street and you accidentally slipped on the curb and you were going to fall forward, your hands will immediately come out forward and you'll catch yourself with your hands. That's hand supporting. That's a safety reflex. And your elbows won't lock because if they locked, you'd break your elbow or your wrist. So your hands come out and then you get a little kind of shock absorption in your elbows when you fall. So that's the motion that Angela was making that you couldn't see.
Yes.
So I just thought I'd explain what that is. But yes, an awareness. If you're listening right now and you're not driving in a vehicle, and you take your hands and put them directly out in front of you, and then kind of bring them around the sides of your body, that's your personal bubble, right? So having awareness of where your body ends and somebody else's begins, and what the appropriate amount of space is between you and another human being comes with hand supporting. And we often see that when kids have poor emotional boundaries, it's because they have poor physical boundaries because they don't have this awareness.
Yeah, so interesting. It's always linked, Mary. I feel like every episode is going to be that it's all connected and it's never
Yes,
just one thing, right?
it's never just one thing. Well, and speaking of that, hand supporting is vital for STNR, for crawling on all
It
fours.
is very much so. Yes, it's one of the pieces that I often start with if
Hmm.
STNR is delayed. Yep,
Hmm.
you're absolutely right. Um,
Because we can't bear our full weight on our arms and our hands if we don't have hand supporting. Kids will fall down into STNR. There's three parts to STNR for the listeners, and they'll fall down into the earlier stage, where the baby's tush is up and their head is down, because they don't have the hand supporting to keep themselves upright. So then they'll find an alternate pattern because they can't get into quadruped, right? Hmm.
all
Back to
because
compensation.
back to compensation and bodies are cool, like, they're gonna do what they need to do.
Hmm.
And we've got lots of different options, right? Like, bodies are gonna figure it out, because we want to interact with our environments, we wanna survive,
Hmm.
and bodies are made to survive. It may not always look the way we want it to, but they are gonna do it.
Hmm.
Like, that's what they're made for.
Uh, we talked a little bit about speech earlier, just a tiny bit in the cerebellum, but I thought this is such a big thing, particularly in the world of autism. I thought it might warrant just a little bit more time on that in relationship to gross and fine motor skills.
Sure, tell me more.
So, yeah. So there's, two parts to speech, really. There's the expressive language part, which requires us to access the language centers of our brain, the language network. So that's a cognitive processing portion. But then there's also the articulation part, how we move our teeth, tongue, and lips, and our throat, and expel air to make sounds. That's the speech articulation portion. And that's the motor movement. Okay. And oftentimes we find when kids are delayed in speech, like if they have speech apraxia, we have issues with motor movement and the fine motor control of the mouth. But there are gross motor skills that enable those fine motor skills to happen. So, for example, if I don't have good postural control, if my neck, if my torso, my back, and my neck muscles are not strong enough, then these muscles in my face that attach to those muscles that allow for jaw movement are not going to be getting the right support and information for them to do their job. And those are a little bit bigger than the even tinier muscles that move my lips, right? The
Mhm.
jaw muscles are bigger than the muscles that overlap all around the mouth. And so when we think about speech articulation issues, there are always gross motor involved in that as well. And like we talked about hands and feet as well and their relationship to speech. So speech production is a very complicated thing. And people always ask me, when we have kids with like level 3 autism, well, when will they speak? I don't know. That's my honest answer because
Mhm.
how many layers to this are there? How significant is the gross motor deficits? How significant then are the fine motor deficits? Um, and then sometimes there's things going on biologically that they need to address through biomed, like mold or neuroinflammation that can block speech as well. That's a different topic for a different podcast, but it is a factor. So I thought I'd throw that in there. Um, so when we're thinking about even about speech, it is an issue of gross and fine motor when we're looking at the actual motor movement of the mouth and the lips and the tongue involved in that.
Yeah, and also breath support when you said postural
Yes.
control, right? Like, being if you don't have good postural control, it's hard to take an adequate breath and to have, or maybe you're working really hard to breathe and then you aren't able to allocate resources to speech because all you're worried about is trying to take breaths.
Hmm.
So those postural reflexes can help with breath support. And we absolutely love our speech therapists, right? Because we need
Yes.
all angles. Again, we're just reflex integration is just a link. right? So like
Yes.
it's just a piece. And so we're all working together to help these systems, and we're all working together to help kids be able to move through the world a little easier, I think is the goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Um, it's just there's so many complex pieces to our kiddos that we work with.
They are. But we enjoy it and we get to talk about it on this cool podcast. And we there's just so many pieces, and so we're trying to break it down. And Mary does a beautiful job of setting us up and trying to move through it as linear as I will allow because, well, Angela's tough to keep into a linear, but I think we're doing a pretty good job because
She is not.
today I
So,
feel like we talked a lot about our topic of gross motor, fine motor, and how reflexes play a role because, you know, movement comes from reflexes. And
hmm
it's that first step of just as a baby interacting with the world on accident to moving to interacting with the world on purpose. Um,
hmm
and it's so amazing how there's so many pieces and there's so many parts and how they help with so many different things in the brain and the world.
hmm
I don't know.
Yep.
Do you have any parting thoughts for us, Mary?
Hmm. Any parting thoughts for you on gross and fine motor movement? I think I'm going to go back to the point I made earlier that if you're concerned about speech and about handwriting, um, I would look back further.
Mm,
It's rarely about the mouth and the hands. It's usually about postural control, about the big muscles that and and thus the development of that cerebellum that we haven't gotten out to the outer sides of it so that we don't have that the good awareness and that we can help speed that along a little bit by using things like brushing and vibration, like on the hands and the fingers. We can bring awareness to the outer parts of our body. If the brain's like, hey, I don't even know where that is. Like um, in MNRI, like six-ended star is a way that we kind of map out the cerebellum because we start at the navel and then we get these 6 points and then we actually go out to the limbs and all the way down the hand and all the way down the leg. So we're letting the brain know, hey cerebellum, we have all of these parts, but uh 95% of the time when I work with a child, their brain hasn't developed a full awareness of the full extent of their body. And remember that fine motor is the furthest away from the center of your body, right? So eyes, lips, tongue, mouth, fingers, toes. So if we kind of frame it that way, think about what your child is struggling with, but then look back further. Like, what's the lowest common denominator? If they're having trouble holding themselves up, if they get exhausted taking a walk down the street, there's an issue with the bigger muscles that need to be addressed first before you really can address the fine motor.
I like that. And that made me think of when you're addressing gross motor or bigger things or postural. Don't forget, therapists, that play counts
It does.
as being able to strengthen these postures and being able to strengthen muscles because play
hmm
is upright. Play is moving in different planes. Play is using parts of your body that you haven't been using. And so play counts as a way to strengthen these muscles and use them in different ways as you're using reflex integration. So that's
hmm
my little pitch today too.
Okay, I have one more thing
Ooh,
though.
yeah.
So, well, because I always start with hands, mouth, and feet. So I'm sure that somebody who's listening, who's worked with me, would say, well, that seems contradictory to what you just said. It does. So let me explain. Because remember that primitive reflexes start with a sensory input. And Dr. Darren Heath, Barnes Heath calls the hands, mouth, and feet the sensory reflexes. So rooting, sucking, Babkin, Palmer, Plantar, and Babinski. if you think about an infant, that's the way that they initially discover the world is through hands, mouth, and feet. Nursing, holding on to mom or dad, right? So
Crawling to the
when,
breast to get,
right,
yep, using their
right?
toes to crawl to the breast. Yep.
So it's all that input that they get through hands, mouth, and feet that activates the parietal lobe that then activates the motor cortex. So even though gross motor develops before fine motor for movement, our sensory system develops the opposite way. All right. So if you're listening and you are or were my client, that's why I start with hands, mouth, and feet, because we use that sensory input to activate the motor cortex to get intentional movement. And that also develops proprioception in the cerebellum. So we get more activation there, which then allows the other work to go faster, in my humble opinion.
Yeah,
So
no, and
every,
sorry. I was gonna say, and it matches because you have to start somewhere, and you said if you're having trouble or you don't know where to go, start looking backwards, right? So if you're
yes.
working with you've got to you start with safety and sensory and move to those pieces, right? And you
Hmm.
were just giving to me, I feel like it matches because you were just giving, there's a lot of different
Oh,
people who
thanks.
are listening to this podcast, right? And they
Hmm.
start in different places or they get stuck in different
Yes.
places because there's so many different tools and there's so many different ways to approach it that I think it was good advice of like, as a therapist, if you dabble or you're a pro at reflex integration, I need the reminder to sometimes back up or what haven't I addressed yet? Because sometimes it's easy to focus on just the thing and forget to back up or to
Hmm.
loop back because sometimes maybe you started with postural, moved to the hands, and you still feel stuck. It's okay to double back and readdress some things. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think it's great
Absolutely.
advice.
Well,
Awesome.
thanks.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Mary. This was another good recording session. You can email us at brainsinmotionpodcast@gmail.com. You can find Mary at her website, brain-works.org, or on Facebook with her Facebook Reflex Integration groups. If you would like that information, please check our show notes. And you can find Angela at angelapt.com or rainbowdragonbooks.com. Thanks for listening.